Early Israelite warrior. The early Iron Age, spanning roughly 1200 to 1000 BC, marks a formative but often overlooked chapter in the history of Israelite warfare. This period, broadly corresponding to the era of the Judges, saw the Israelites organized not as a centralized polity, but as a loose confederation of tribes. Political authority was localized, fragmented, and temporary. The lack of a standing army or formalized military institutions meant that warfare, when it occurred, was largely reactive and episodic. It was shaped less by long-term strategic planning and more by immediate threats, internal disputes, and opportunistic conflicts with neighboring groups. During this era, leadership in times of conflict emerged through charismatic figures rather than institutional structures. Individuals like Gideon, Jephthah, Samson, and Deborah were recognized for their prowess, religious inspiration, or ability to rally disparate tribal groups against a common enemy. However, their authority was neither hereditary nor bureaucratic. It was contingent upon personal success and divine favor, as understood within the religious worldview of the time. Militias were formed through personal networks of kinship and allegiance rather than through conscription or permanent military service. Warriors were typically farmers, herders, and artisans, taking up arms only when necessity demanded. This decentralized and ad hoc approach to warfare was both a strength and a weakness. On one hand, it allowed for rapid mobilization in localized conflicts, making use of deep familiarity with the terrain and the social cohesion of tribal kinship groups. On the other hand, it severely limited the ability of the Israelites to project power over long distances, sustain prolonged campaigns, or resist more organized external forces for extended periods. Weapons and equipment. Material evidence, biblical accounts, and comparative studies with neighboring cultures suggest that early Israelite warriors operated at a significant technological disadvantage, particularly in the domain of metallurgy. The Philistines, established along the coastal plains, maintained a critical advantage through their control of iron production and working. This technological disparity is explicitly noted in the biblical narrative of 1 Samuel 13:19 through 22, which describes how the Israelites lacked blacksmiths and were dependent upon the Philistines even for agricultural tool maintenance. As a consequence, most early Israelite weaponry consisted of bronze implements, repurposed farming tools, and natural materials such as stone and wood. True bronze swords and daggers were relatively rare and likely limited to wealthier individuals or tribal leaders. More commonly, combatants adapted agricultural implements, tools designed for daily survival, into lethal weapons. Mattocks, sickles, and ox goads became standard fare for many Israelite warriors. The story of Shamgar in Judges 3:31, who reportedly struck down 600 Philistines with an ox goad, while certainly stylized, reflects the practical realities of the time. Necessity bred improvisation. For ranged combat, slings were the most widespread and effective weapon available. Simple to manufacture and requiring only stones or hardened clay projectiles, slings were accessible to all and highly effective in skilled hands. In close terrain or defensive situations, slingers could harass and disrupt enemy formations without the need for expensive or difficult to maintain armaments. Bows also existed, but they appear less prominently in early accounts, and archaeological evidence suggests that their use may have been relatively limited compared to other Near Eastern cultures of the same period. Arrows, when used, typically bore flint or bronze heads, again reflecting the constraints imposed by limited access to iron. Improvised weaponry should not be interpreted as a sign of primitiveness. Rather, it reflects a resourceful adaptation to material scarcity and an ability to transform everyday tools into effective instruments of war. These adaptations were functional, durable, and suited to the kinds of warfare the Israelites most often faced: skirmishes, raids, and defensive actions, rather than prolonged field engagements. Defensive equipment and armor. Protective gear among early Israelite warriors was minimal, constrained both by technological limitations and the decentralized, militia-based nature of their forces. The average combatant would have entered battle wearing a simple linen or woolen tunic. Belts were used to secure small weapons, carry pouches of sling stones, or gird the garment for greater mobility during combat. Footwear likely consisted of basic sandals, though many may have fought barefoot depending on conditions and personal circumstances. Shields were employed but were typically small and constructed from organic materials, wooden frames covered with stretched leather. These shields provided some defense against projectiles and blows, but would have been insufficient against more sophisticated weaponry, such as iron-tipped spears or arrows. The size and construction of these shields suggest a focus on mobility rather than static defense. Helmets, where they existed, were likely simple constructions of hardened leather rather than metal. Metal helmets, whether of bronze or iron, were expensive, required specialized craftsmanship, and are unlikely to have been widely available outside of the wealthiest or most important warriors. Body armor was even rarer. Scale armor, a technology involving the sewing of metal scales onto a cloth or leather backing, was likely unknown among the early Israelites at the common soldier level. The biblical description of Goliath in 1 Samuel 17, who is depicted as wearing an elaborate coat of mail, is presented not as typical, but as extraordinary and foreign. His heavily armored appearance would have been an imposing and unfamiliar sight to early Israelite fighters, emphasizing the asymmetry of military technology between them and their better-equipped adversaries. Appearance and military identity. In visual terms, the early Israelite warrior would have been virtually indistinguishable from the average agrarian worker. Bearded, dressed in simple tunics, and armed with improvised or basic weapons, these fighters presented no standardized appearance. There were no formal uniforms, military insignia, or regulated dress codes to distinguish combatants from civilians. Warfare was understood as a temporary obligation, deeply tied to household and clan responsibilities rather than to a distinct military profession. This lack of uniformity reflected the broader social structure of the Israelite tribes. Without centralized governance, there was no mechanism for equipping large bodies of men uniformly. Kinship and tribal loyalty served as the primary organizing principles, and military efforts were often extensions of familial or intertribal disputes. Warriors fought alongside relatives and neighbors, and group identity was maintained more by social bonds than by any external markers of rank or affiliation. The contrast with neighboring cultures, such as the Egyptians or Assyrians, who fielded standing armies with distinct units and visual markers of rank, is significant. Early Israelite warfare was personal, localized, and community-driven, characteristics that shaped not only how battles were fought, but also how warriors perceived themselves and their role within society. Methods of warfare. Given their organizational structure, technological limitations, and material constraints, it is not surprising that early Israelite warfare emphasized flexibility, speed, and familiarity with the terrain. Conventional set-piece battles were rare and, when they occurred, often involved limited numbers of combatants. Instead, early Israelite tactics favored ambushes, raids, and defensive actions, leveraging the advantages of local knowledge and mobility. Ambushes were a natural tactic for lightly equipped forces operating in rugged or broken terrain. The campaign of Gideon against the Midianites, as described in Judges 7, exemplifies the use of surprise and psychological disruption. With a small, highly motivated force, Gideon achieved a decisive victory by exploiting confusion and fear among a numerically superior enemy. Raiding, both as a form of preemptive defense and economic survival, was common. Tribes would conduct raids against enemy settlements, livestock, and resources, weakening opponents without engaging in costly open battles. These raids were often conducted quickly, with warriors striking vulnerable targets and retreating before a coordinated response could be mounted. Defensive warfare focused on protecting settlements, key water sources, and agricultural land. Fortified sites, though relatively small, played an important role. Basic defensive structures, stone walls, gates, and towers, provided refuge during enemy attacks and served as focal points for local defense efforts. However, These fortifications were modest compared to the large, heavily fortified cities of the Canaanites or Philistines. When conventional battles did occur, they were typically fought on a small scale and in geographically constrained areas such as narrow valleys or hilltops. Terrain often dictated the tactics employed, and early Israelite commanders demonstrated considerable adaptability in using the environment to offset technological disadvantages. Direct engagements would focus on breaking enemy morale quickly, rather than engaging in prolonged or attritional fighting. Conclusion. The early period of Israelite warfare thus reveals a system of conflict shaped more by necessity than by grand design. Tribal organization, technological constraints, and localized threats fostered a style of warfare that emphasized improvisation, personal valor, and adaptability. While limited in their ability to wage extended campaigns or challenge more organized enemies head-on, the Israelites of the Judges period developed practical skills in guerrilla tactics, raiding and defensive warfare that would lay important foundations for later developments. As Israelite society moved toward greater centralization under the institution of kingship, particularly during the reigns of Saul and David, these early experiences in decentralized warfare would inform, but also be transformed by, the emergence of a more structured and professional military apparatus.